May 2024. I was 20 years old sitting at the long mahogany dining table in our house in Louisville, Kentucky. The kind of house that looked nicer on the outside than it ever felt on the inside. The air smelled of roast beef and whiskey, the usual scent of family dinners that left me sick before dessert was even served. My stepdad, Rick Morton, leaned back in his chair, smirking the way he always did when he was about to remind everyone who he thought was in charge. His voice cut through the chatter. "You will die, broke without a man, Emily." He said it loud enough for my uncles and cousins to hear, loud enough for my mother Susan to pretend she did not, loud enough to make me feel stripped bare in front of people who should have been family. My cheeks burned, but not from shame. I wanted to scream that he was wrong, that I had more than he could ever understand, but I swallowed it because revealing the truth too soon would have destroyed the only weapon I had. He thought I was powerless. He thought I was a burden. A weak girl living under his roof, eating food bought with his money, existing because he allowed it. He had no idea that 20 miles away in Lexington, a safe deposit box at Evans and Green law firm contained the real words of my grandmother, Clara Carter. He had no clue that she had signed her name in neat ink to a will that made me the sole heir to her entire estate. $5 million in real property investments and bonds. My stepdad was so sure I was nothing that he never imagined I was already everything he wanted to be. I remember the way his eyes glittered when he leaned closer, his whiskey breath sour, his teeth clenched around the words. "A girl without a man has no future. Do you know what happens to women like you? They rot, they crawl back, begging. And you, Emily, you will crawl." He laughed, then a sound that made my skin crawl, a sound that drew a few uncomfortable chuckles from the others who feared him too much to confront him. My mother kept her eyes fixed on her plate, her fork scraping porcelain, her silence a louder betrayal than anything he could have said. I wanted to tell her that her silence had destroyed me more than his words ever could, but she was too far gone, too entangled in his control. I clenched my hands in my lap, my nails pressing crescents into my skin, anchoring myself to the secret I carried. For 2 years, I had lived with the weight of a sealed envelope my grandmother pressed into my hands in Lexington when I was 17. "For when the time is right," she had whispered. I had hidden that envelope at the bottom of my suitcase, carried it through every storm Rick had thrown at me, and kept it like a lifeline. Now the time was close. My 20th birthday had passed. The will was about to activate. And Rick Morton, with his sneers and his fists and his pathetic hunger for money, was days away from learning that the girl he mocked had just inherited everything he wanted. Sitting there listening to him declare my worthlessness, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic. The man who bragged about controlling me, who boasted about his business connections at a rundown auto shop, was about to be crushed under the weight of my grandmother's love for me. Love he could never understand because it did not come with conditions. It came with trust, with belief, with legacy. I took a sip of water, forcing my hands steady, forcing my face into the blank mask I had learned to wear. Do you know what it feels like to sit at a table where you are despised and yet you hold the card that can burn it all down? Do you know what it feels like to taste revenge before it is served? That night, I knew. Rick's voice droned on, bragging about his plans to flip Grandma Clara's property once she was gone. He did not know she was already gone, that her will had already spoken that nothing belonged to him. He thought he was the king of the table. I knew he was about to be dethroned. The rage in me simmered, but so did something sharper, colder, more deliberate. I would not fight him with fists. I would not scream or beg. I would wait. I would gather proof. I would choose my battlefield carefully. And when the moment came, I would end his reign in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. That night, he thought he broke me. He had no idea I was about to break him. He thought my silence was weakness. He had no clue it was the trap. And when I sprung it, the entire city would know his empire was built on lies. Back in 2015, I was 11 years old and still believed that life would unfold the way it did in movies, where fathers were steady and mothers were safe. My father, David Carter, was a truck driver who hauled freight along the I-64 corridor between Louisville and Lexington. One rainy night in October, his rig jackknifed near Frankfurt. I remember the flashing lights outside our house when the police officer knocked at the door. My mother, Susan, crumpled against the wall, wailing into her hands. I stood frozen, trying to understand how a man who kissed my forehead every night could suddenly be gone. His absence hollowed out the house. It left silence where there used to be laughter, and I learned fast that silence is not always peace. For a year, we stumbled through life, my mother working part-time at a clinic, me trying to focus on school, while every corner of the house reminded me of my father's boots or his scent of motor oil. By 2016, my mother began to change. She smiled at her phone more than at me. She started wearing perfume again, bought new dresses, and when she announced she was dating a man named Rick Morton from Louisville, I wanted to believe it was good for her. But even then, I felt a warning in my bones. Rick was different. He owned a small auto shop, claimed to be a businessman, yet every conversation dripped with bitterness about money. The first time he came to dinner, he looked around our living room as if appraising it for resale. I was 12 and too polite to speak, but I remember thinking he did not see us as people. He saw us as something to conquer. In 2017, when I was 13, my mother married him in a courthouse ceremony in downtown Louisville. No white dress, no music, just a few signatures, and a man who placed his hand on her shoulder like she was property. From that day, our home was no longer mine. It was his. Rules appeared overnight. No friends over unless he approved them. No phone calls after 9. No walking to the library without telling him first. At first, I thought he was being protective. Then I noticed how his rules never applied to himself. He would come home late, slam doors, bark questions, and my mother would shrink into her chair. If I tried to answer back, he would sneer, telling me I was mouthy, telling me a girl needed to be kept in line. He confiscated my phone once because he said a 13-year-old girl had no business texting boys from school. I was humiliated when he read my messages out loud to my mother, nothing but homework notes, but he twisted them into something shameful. My mother stayed silent. That silence burned worse than his words. By late 2017, Rick had made it clear he saw me not as a child, but as a rival for control of the house. He wanted total obedience. I remember one Sunday evening when I tried to leave the table before finishing my chores. He grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to send a message. His voice low so the neighbors would not hear. "You live under my roof. You follow my rules." That was the moment I realized my childhood was over. I had stepped into a world where power meant everything, and I had none. Yet somewhere inside me, I also knew power could shift. I just had to survive long enough to find the moment. Between 2015 and 2017, I went from being a girl who still drew hearts in the margins of her notebooks to someone who measured every word, every step, every silence. My father's death had broken one world. My mother's remarriage had built another, darker one. And in that world, Rick Morton stood at the center, convinced he had already won. He believed a 13-year-old girl could not resist him. He believed grief had made me weak. He believed his control was permanent. But he had no idea that grief does not only weaken. It hardens, it teaches, it sharpens. What he saw as my silence was not surrender. It was the beginning of my calculation. He thought I was just a child. He had no clue that I was already watching, already learning, already preparing for the day his empire of rules would collapse. By 2019, I was 15, and the rules in our house had hardened into chains. Rick Morton was no longer simply a stepfather trying to play head of the household. He had become a warden, and I was his captive. Every day began with his voice echoing down the hallway demanding that chores be done before breakfast. If the laundry was not folded to his liking, he would grab the shirt in question, wave it in my face, and declare that I was lazy, worthless, spoiled. He always compared me to other girls and town girls who supposedly obeyed their father's girls who would never dare speak out. My mother, Susan, sat through these tirades, stirring her coffee, nodding sometimes, but never once defending me. Her silence taught me that love does not always equal protection. Sometimes it equals fear. I tried to keep my head down at school, to lose myself in books and debate club, but the moment I walked back into our Louisville house, I felt the weight of his eyes on me. One afternoon in the spring of 2019, I forgot to take out the trash. Rick came home, saw the bin still full, and in front of my mother, he slapped the back of my hand with a newspaper so hard it stung. He laughed afterward, saying it was just discipline. My mother whispered, "She should learn Rick," and that sentence carved itself into my bones. By the summer of 2020, I was 16, and the control had grown more invasive. Rick demanded to know who texted me, demanded to see my phone every evening. If he found a boy's name, even a classmate from algebra, he would twist the words into something filthy. Accuse me of trying to sneak behind his back. Accuse me of shaming the family. Once he read aloud a simple homework question a boy had sent me and then turned to my mother saying, "See, this is what happens when you let girls think for themselves." My face burned with humiliation, not because of the message, but because my mother looked away instead of telling him he was wrong. That same year, he cut off my allowance, saying a girl should not have money of her own. He claimed he was teaching me responsibility, but what he was really teaching me was dependence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. Instead, I learned to hide. I hid notebooks under my mattress filled with essays for debate team. I hid library books at the bottom of my backpack. I hid my anger inside long breaths taken in the bathroom mirror. In 2021, when I turned 17, I earned a scholarship offer from the University of Kentucky for economics and law. It should have been a moment of joy. Instead, Rick tore open the letter before I even got home, waved it in the air, and announced that I was not going anywhere. No daughter of his would be moving away to Lexington on her own. "You want to play lawyer?" he sneered. "You do it from community college here in Louisville where I can keep an eye on you." My heart shattered, but I did not cry. Crying gave him satisfaction. Instead, I tucked away the acceptance letter in a folder, along with every insult he had thrown, every rule he had enforced, every time he told me I would never be enough. That spring, he began keeping the car keys in his pocket, so I could not even drive to the library without permission. Once, when I protested, he gripped my arm just tight enough to leave faint marks. Not enough to show the world, but enough for me to see in the mirror and know what he was capable of. My mother said nothing. Her silence had become so natural it was like background noise. Yet even in those years, something inside me refused to die. I read every case study on property law I could find. I memorized statutes about wills and inheritance. Knowledge became my rebellion. While he thought I was folding laundry, I was reading. While he thought I was scrubbing floors, I was planning. Every insult sharpened me. Every act of control hardened me. Every silence from my mother became another reminder that if I wanted to survive, I would have to become my own defender. By the end of 2021, I had stopped being the child who reacted. I had become the young woman who observed. Rick thought he had crushed me. He thought obedience meant victory. He thought silence meant defeat. But he did not realize that silence can also be a weapon, and mine was getting sharper every day. The summer of 2021 was supposed to be like every other summer, a blur of heat and rules and the constant shadow of Rick Morton in our Louisville house. But that July, my mother allowed me to spend a week with my grandmother Clara in Lexington. She said it was because Rick wanted time alone with her, but to me, it felt like a breath of air after years of suffocation. The moment I stepped into Grandma's house, I felt different. Her little brick home near Woodland Park smelled of lavender and old books, not whiskey and grease. The light through her lace curtains seemed to soften the edges of my life, and for a while I almost forgot the heaviness waiting back in Louisville. Grandma Clara was 82, her hair a crown of silver, her hands still steady when she held her teacup. She was not just my grandmother. She was my safe place, the one person who saw me not as a problem to be solved, but as someone worth believing in. She would sit across from me at her kitchen table and ask real questions. "How are you, Emily, really?" She would not accept silence as an answer. That week, I finally told her pieces of the truth. Not everything, because shame still wrapped around me like barbed wire, but enough for her to know that Rick was cruel, that my mother had disappeared behind his voice, that I felt trapped. She listened without interruption, her blue eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "One day, Emily, you will have the power," she said. It was not a cliché. It was a promise. A few days later, she asked me to follow her to the bedroom. She opened her dresser drawer and pulled out a small envelope sealed with wax. She pressed it into my hands. "For when the time is right." I stared at it, my heart hammering. "What is it, Grandma?" She only smiled. "Just keep it safe. You will know when to open it." At 17, I did not know what she meant, but I understood the gravity of her tone. That envelope felt heavier than paper should. I slipped it into the bottom of my suitcase under folded jeans, determined not to let anyone see it, especially Rick. During the rest of that week, she cooked me breakfasts, told me stories of her own youth when she had defied her father to marry my grandfather, and reminded me that strength sometimes hides in patience. When I left Lexington and returned to Louisville, the weight of Rick's house hit me again. The smell of oil and liquor, the sound of him snapping at my mother, the feeling of his eyes watching me like a hawk for mistakes. But tucked inside my belongings was that sealed envelope. Every night when he barked at me every time my mother looked away, I thought of it. It became my anchor. Sometimes I would touch the corner of it through the fabric of my suitcase and imagine it was a shield, invisible but powerful. Rick believed he had stripped me of hope. He had no idea that my grandmother had given me a weapon silent and waiting. That summer was the first time I realized that I did not have to live the rest of my life under his thumb. I did not know how or when, but I knew there would come a day when his voice would no longer define me. And that day would begin with the breaking of a seal. That week in Lexington planted a seed. I returned to school that fall still bound by his rules, but carrying a secret that kept me from breaking. Whenever Rick told me I was nothing, I thought of my grandmother's whisper. "One day, Emily, you will have the power." And I believed her. By 2022, I was 18, and the walls of our Louisville house felt narrower with each passing month. I had grown taller, my voice steadier, but inside I still carried the same knot of fear every time Rick Morton opened his mouth. He strutted around like a king, yet he was drowning in debt from his failing auto shop. His talk at the dinner table shifted from controlling me to circling like a vulture over my grandmother Clara's assets in Lexington. He never spoke of her with affection, only with calculation. Once in February, he leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of bourbon, and said to my mother with a smirk, "Once your mom dies, that house is mine." He said it so casually, as if death were just a financial transaction. My mother looked down at her plate, muttering something about timing, but she did not correct him. I sat frozen rage simmering in my chest. Clara was still alive, still cooking her oatmeal every morning in Lexington, still laughing softly when she called me on the phone. But to Rick, she was already a corpse attached to a property deed. That spring, I began noticing how he collected property magazines, circled numbers, and talked about renovations he would make once the Lexington house was his. I heard him on the phone with a friend bragging that he would soon have prime real estate near the University District. He laughed and said, "Emily is too stupid to manage property. I will get Susan to handle it." The words stabbed me, but also steeled me. For the first time, I pulled out my phone and hit record. His voice filled the speaker, dripping with greed. That was the first of many recordings. At first, it felt dangerous, my hands shaking as I pressed stop, but after a while, it became a ritual. If Rick opened his mouth, I captured it. He did not know that every insult, every boast, every plan to steal what was not his was being stored quietly on a device he thought he controlled. By the summer of 2022, his obsession grew. He began driving to Lexington more often, pretending to run errands but circling Clara's neighborhood. One night, I overheard him telling my mother that once her mother died, they would sell off the stocks and bonds and finally be free of money trouble. Susan's voice was hesitant but not resistant. I realized then that my mother had been pulled into his fantasy. She was no longer just silent. She was complicit. That knowledge nearly broke me. Yet it also made my grandmother's envelope feel even heavier, like a shield I could not yet use. My 18th birthday passed quietly. No celebration except a curt nod from Rick. But inside me, another resolve was born. I would not wait passively for him to destroy everything. I began documenting more. Photos of property magazines he left lying around. Screenshots of texts he sent my mother about selling assets. Recordings of his late-night rants about how the Carter women owed him. Each piece felt like a stone added to a wall. I was building a wall that one day would turn into a fortress. I remember one July evening when Clara called and asked how I was. I wanted to tell her everything, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I said, "I am fine, Grandma." She paused as if she could hear the lie in my voice. "Remember, Emily?" she whispered. "Patience is power." I clutched the phone, tears stinging my eyes. Rick stormed into the room right after and demanded who I was talking to. I smiled faintly, said it was a classmate. Inside, I was screaming. He thought he had silenced me, but all he had done was teach me to speak in a different language, the language of evidence. By the end of 2022, my folders were full. My phone contained hours of recordings. My backpack carried notes of dates and times. Rick still strutted through the house declaring that Clara's wealth would be his. He believed no one could stop him. He believed I was too small, too scared, too weak. What he did not know was that every word he spoke was already being stored as the rope he would one day hang himself with. He thought I was just the girl at his table. He had no idea I was the witness, the recorder, the archivist of his downfall. March 2023 arrived with the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I was 19 and halfway through a semester at Jefferson Community College in Louisville, still carrying the scholarship letter from the University of Kentucky in a folder under my bed like a relic from a life I was not allowed to live. The call came early one Sunday morning. My grandmother Clara had passed away in her sleep at her home in Lexington. My mother Susan answered the phone, her face pale, her hand trembling, but when she hung up, Rick was already standing behind her, eyes shining not with grief but with calculation. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose it is finally time to put things in order." I ran upstairs before they could see the tears spill down my face. Clara had been my anchor, my secret confidant, the only person who reminded me that love was not supposed to hurt. Losing her felt like losing oxygen. For hours, I sat on my bed, clutching the envelope she had given me 2 years before, the seal still unbroken in my mind, replaying her words. "For when the time is right." I wanted to tear it open right then, but fear held me back. What if I misunderstood? What if there was nothing inside but a letter of encouragement? What if I destroyed the one thing she trusted me with too soon? I pressed it back into the suitcase, promising myself I would wait. The funeral was scheduled for March 20th at St. Paul's Church in Lexington, a modest brick building where Clara had sung in the choir for decades. The day of the service, the sky was iron gray, and the air smelled of wet soil and lilies. I wore a black dress that felt too thin against the wind. As soon as we arrived, Rick began strutting across the parking lot, greeting distant relatives as if he were the host rather than the unwanted son-in-law. My mother clung to his arm, her face expressionless. Inside the church, I could barely hear the hymns over the pounding in my ears. When the pastor spoke of Clara's generosity and dignity, my throat tightened until I thought I might choke. She had been the only one to look at me and see potential rather than burden. And now she was gone. After the service, family gathered in the fellowship hall. There were sandwiches and weak coffee, but the real focus was not food. It was the whispers about the estate. Clara's home near Woodland Park, the stocks she had quietly nurtured, the investments she had made decades earlier that had blossomed into real wealth. Cousins speculated, uncles argued, but Rick spoke with certainty. "That house will be ours soon," he declared to a group of relatives. "Susan's mother wanted her family cared for, and I am her family now." His voice carried across the room, drawing glares but no open challenges. My fists clenched at my sides. He was speaking as though Clara's blood was not still warm in the ground. He was speaking as though I did not exist. My heart pounded with rage, but I kept silent. Later that afternoon, the attorney Evans, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a calm presence, asked immediate family to gather. I followed my mother and Rick into a small side office. Evans adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. "The official will cannot be disclosed in full until probate begins," he said, "but I can tell you that Mrs. Carter left behind significant assets. At this stage, what I can share is that the primary heir is not what some of you may expect." Rick leaned forward, his voice oily. "We all know it should be Susan. She is the daughter." Evans did not flinch. I cannot disclose details yet, he repeated, but the matter will be clarified in due time. For now, please respect the process. Rick's jaw tightened, his face darkening. He grabbed Susan's hand and muttered, "Do not worry, it will all be ours." Evans's words echoed in my head. Not what some of you may expect. Did that mean me? Did that mean the envelope in my suitcase was more than just a letter? I wanted to shout to demand answers, but fear kept me quiet. If I revealed anything too soon, Rick would tear it from me before I had proof. That night, back in Louisville, he poured himself a drink and sat smugly in the recliner. Finally, he said, this family will have some real money. No more struggling. We will sell off the old house, cash out the stocks, and be free. He looked at me with contempt. And you, Emily, you will finally learn what it means to live under a real man's roof. My mother nodded faintly, her face pale, her eyes blank. I went to bed with my heart pounding, the envelope burning in my suitcase like a live coal. Grief and rage tangled inside me until I could barely breathe. Clara was gone. Rick was circling her legacy like a vulture. Evans had hinted that things were not as Rick believed, but the details were still locked away. I knew then that the months ahead would determine everything. I would either be consumed by his greed, or I would find the strength to honor the trust Clara had placed in me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Rick's laughter echo down the hallway, and whispered into the dark, "One day you will choke on those words. You think you have won, but you have no idea what is coming." April 2023 settled in with the bloom of dogwoods across Louisville, but inside our house, the air felt heavy and stale. I was 19 and still reeling from Clara's funeral when Rick began to show his teeth more openly. He strutted around the kitchen with a stack of papers he claimed were from Evans, though I suspected he had drafted them himself or pressured my mother into helping. "These need your signature, Emily," he said one evening, sliding the documents across the table. "They are just acknowledgments that you are not contesting your mother's right to the estate." His smile was too wide, his eyes too eager. My mother Susan stood beside him, wringing her hands. "Just sign them, Emily. It will make everything smoother." Her voice cracked, but she did not look at me. She looked at him. My throat tightened. I glanced at the pages. Legal jargon littered every line, but the gist was clear. If I signed, I was forfeiting any claim to my grandmother's property, investments, everything. I pushed the papers back across the table. "I want to talk to Evans myself," I said. Rick's smile evaporated. He leaned forward, his breath hot, his voice low. "Do not play games with me. You are a child. You have no claim here." He slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the house, and my mother flinched but said nothing. Fear prickled my skin, but beneath it was something harder, Clara's whisper from 2 years before, "For when the time is right." That night, after they went to bed, I pulled the envelope from my suitcase. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, the wax cracking like thunder in the silence. Inside was not a letter, but a photocopy of a signed will dated March 2021. My heart raced as my eyes scanned the lines. "I, Clara Carter, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, including real property, investments, and personal assets, valued at approximately $5 million to my granddaughter, Emily Carter, effective upon her reaching the age of 20, or upon legal marriage, whichever comes first." My breath caught. The room tilted. For 2 years, I had carried the key to everything, and only now did I understand the full weight. She had chosen me, not my mother, not Rick, not the cousins. Me. Tears blurred the page, but inside me something fierce ignited. All the humiliation, all the slaps of words and fists, all the nights of silence, they had not broken me. They had prepared me. Rick thought I was powerless, but Clara had already armed me. I tucked the document back into the envelope and hid it deep beneath the lining of my suitcase. For the next week, Rick pressed harder. Every evening he shoved the documents at me, demanded my signature, threatened that refusing would mean consequences. He accused me of being ungrateful, of trying to embarrass the family. Susan echoed him in softer tones, pleading, "Please, Emily, just sign so we can move on." I stared at her, wondering when she had stopped being my mother and started being his accomplice. The more they pressed, the calmer I became, because now I knew. I had proof. I had a weapon that could not be ignored. I started making copies of the photocopy, hiding them in my backpack, slipping one between the pages of a textbook, another taped beneath my desk drawer. If Rick found one, another would survive. At night, I replayed Evans's words in my head. Not what some of you may expect. I realized he knew too. He was waiting for the right moment. Until then, I had to survive. One night, Rick cornered me in the hallway, his face flushed with anger. "You think you are clever," he hissed, "but you are nothing without us. You will sign or I will make sure you regret it." I stared back at him, my voice steady. "I will not sign anything without Evans present." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He did not know how much I knew. He did not know the envelope had already been opened, and he had no idea that every threat he made was being quietly recorded on my phone in my pocket. That April night, I lay awake clutching the photocopy against my chest, grief for Clara mixed with fire in my veins. The buried truth was mine now, alive in ink and paper, and no matter how much Rick shouted or how much Susan begged, I would not let it go. He thought he had cornered me. He thought my silence meant surrender. But the truth had already shifted the ground beneath him, and soon the walls of his empire would crack. The summer of 2023 pressed down on Louisville like a furnace, the air thick with humidity and tension. By then, I was 19 weeks away from turning 20, and every day in our house felt like walking across glass. Rick Morton had sensed something shift after April. He could not prove it, but he knew I was resisting him. His response was to clamp down harder. He began keeping the car keys on a chain clipped to his belt, so I could not even drive to the grocery store without him. He locked the Wi-Fi router in his office and handed out the password only when he felt like it. He checked my phone nightly, scrolling through texts and emails with suspicion, accusing me of hiding things he could not name. The more he controlled, the more determined I became. I learned to adapt. I deleted recordings from my phone after backing them up on cloud storage at the library, telling him I was working on class projects. I kept copies of the will in places he would never look like, slipped inside hymnals at St. Paul's when I visited Lexington with cousins. He thought he was shutting every door, but he was only teaching me to find windows. One humid night in June, I refused to sign his stack of documents again. His face twisted with rage. He grabbed my wrist, his grip so tight I felt the bones grind. My mother, Susan, stood in the doorway, wringing her hands, whispering, "Rick, please," but when he barked at her, she fell silent. The next morning, I woke to bruises blooming on my arm, dark and undeniable. I took photos with shaking hands, uploading them to a hidden folder. Each image became another brick in the case I was building. Rick believed fear would silence me. Instead, it sharpened me. In July, he started following me around the house, demanding to know where I was going, even if I was just walking to the kitchen. He accused me of sneaking calls to Evans, accused me of plotting against him. His paranoia bled into everything. He lectured my mother for hours about loyalty, about how we needed to present a united front. Sometimes I heard her crying in the bathroom, but when she emerged, she always repeated his words like they were gospel. I stopped expecting her to protect me. She was too far gone. Yet even in that cage, I kept planning. At night while they slept, I studied property law textbooks, memorized inheritance rules, mapped out the steps Evans would need to bring the will forward. I wrote down dates of every threat, every act of control, every bruise. My notes filled an entire notebook hidden under the lining of my mattress. By August, Rick was drunk more often, his rants slurred but still venomous. One evening, he cornered me in the kitchen, demanding again that I sign his documents. When I refused, he slammed his fist against the counter so hard the ceramic bowl cracked. "You think you can outsmart me?" he roared. "You are nothing without this family." His spit hit my cheek, but I kept my face still, my voice steady. "I will not sign." His eyes narrowed, a dangerous gleam sparking, but he stormed out instead of striking me again. Later that night, I added his words to my growing file, my hands trembling with adrenaline. Each confrontation was a storm, but inside me a calm center grew. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. As the summer dragged on, I felt like a soldier biding time before battle. My 20th birthday loomed in May 2024, and with it, the moment the will would activate beyond doubt. Rick thought he could crush me before then. He thought he could grind me down into submission. But every time he raised his voice, every time he tightened his grip, every time my mother chose silence, my resolve grew. The house became a prison, but my mind became a fortress. He believed he was winning. He had no idea I was already setting the stage for his fall. By October 2023, the air in Louisville carried the chill of autumn crisp leaves scattering along Bardstown Road, but inside our house, the heat of Rick Morton's anger never cooled. He had spent the summer tightening his grip, convinced that if he kept pressing, I would eventually fold. Instead, I grew sharper, steadier, like a blade honed by constant friction. I knew the time had come to shift from surviving to counterattacking. The first step was gathering every shred of proof. I spent long afternoons at the library near downtown Louisville under the excuse of working on research papers. In truth, I was uploading voice recordings, bruised arm photos, and scanned copies of the forged papers Rick had tried to force me to sign into a secure drive. Each file was labeled with dates and details evidence cataloged like a case lawyer Evans himself might prepare. One Saturday evening, Rick was bragging on the phone about how soon the Lexington property would be sold, how no one could stop him, how Emily is too naive to know what is coming. I pressed record under the table, my heart pounding, and captured every word. Later, I transferred it to my drive, knowing that someday soon those words would echo in a courtroom or a newsroom. My mother Susan was more fragile by then, her eyes red, more often, her voice quieter. Yet whenever Rick shoved the documents at me, she joined in. "Please, Emily, just sign," she would whisper, as if signing away my future would bring peace. I began to understand that she was too entangled, too broken to see beyond his control. Saving her was not an option. Saving myself was. In mid-October, I arranged to meet Evans. I told Rick I had an extra class and took the bus to his Lexington office. My hands trembled as I placed the thick folder of copies on his desk. Inside are recordings, photos, notes, and a copy of the will Clara gave me. I said, my voice shaking but steady enough to carry. Evans studied me, his eyes kind but sharp. "Emily." "This is enough to stop him." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "The will is clear. You are the heir. What remains is not whether you inherit, but how to reveal it so he cannot twist the narrative." My chest tightened. "How do we do that?" Evans paused, then leaned forward. "We need a stage he cannot control. Somewhere public with witnesses, with people of influence. Somewhere his voice will not drown yours." My mind raced. That was when I remembered Rick's favorite boast. For months, he had been planning a grand charity gala at the Louisville Marriott for May 2024. He bragged that it would attract business owners, local politicians, even reporters. He called it his chance to prove his worth to the city. My lips curled into a faint smile. That is it. We will expose him on his own stage. Evans nodded slowly. "It will be risky but effective. Between now and then we prepare. Every record must be airtight. Every document must be ready." His calm words steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt not just like prey, but like a strategist. That night back in Louisville, I lay in bed listening to Rick snore down the hall, the sound of a man certain of his coming triumph. He had no idea that I had already armed a lawyer with everything needed to bring him down. Through October and into November, I played my role carefully. I nodded when he boasted. I stayed silent when he insulted me. I accepted his new restrictions as if defeated. Meanwhile, I continued to document everything. I kept a hidden notebook where I wrote his exact words each night. "You are worthless without me. You will be nothing when I take that house." He repeated variations so often it was as if he believed saying them aloud could make them true. Each repetition only made my case stronger. Sometimes, when the weight felt unbearable, I touched the copy of the will hidden in my backpack and reminded myself that the ground beneath him was crumbling. He just could not feel it yet. By Halloween, the neighborhood was lit with pumpkins and children in costumes. Our house was dark, Rick refusing to hand out candy, grumbling about waste. I watched from my window as kids laughed on the sidewalk free, in a way I had not felt for years, and I whispered to myself, just a few more months. The plan was set. Evans had the files. The gala date was confirmed for May 25th, 2024. My 20th birthday would have passed the condition of the will satisfied. In that ballroom, Rick would stand tall before the city, bragging as always until Evans and I pulled the floor out from under him. He thought my silence meant surrender. He thought my obedience meant defeat. But in truth, my silence was the mask behind which I built my counterstrike. October 2023 was the month I stopped being a victim in my own story. It was the month I became the author of Rick Morton's downfall. May 25th, 2024, the date that had lived in my head for months, finally arrived. Louisville was glowing in early summer warmth, the air thick with magnolia blossoms. The Louisville Marriott downtown loomed ahead, glass gleaming under the afternoon sun. Inside, chandeliers glistened above polished marble floors, and 200 guests drifted through the grand ballroom. Businessmen in tailored suits clinked glasses, local politicians shook hands, reporters scribbled in notebooks. This was Rick Morton's dream stage the night he believed would crown him as a man of influence. He strutted from table to table in his tuxedo, slapping shoulders, telling stories that made people laugh too loudly, his arm wrapped around my mother Susan like a trophy. He looked every bit the host he wanted to be. But I knew the truth. Beneath the black bow tie and the smug smile was a man whose empire rested on lies. Tonight, those lies would shatter. I stood near the back of the room in a simple navy dress, heart-pounding but face composed. Evans, calm as ever in his dark suit, gave me a small nod from across the room. His briefcase rested at his side, and inside that briefcase was the original will Clara Carter had signed, the one Rick never imagined existed. For hours, I had rehearsed this moment in my mind. I had pictured the hush of the crowd, the flicker of disbelief, the weight of revelation. Now it was here, and my chest tightened with both terror and exhilaration. Rick climbed onto the small stage at the center of the ballroom, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate family community and the bright future we are building together." Applause rippled across the room. My mother smiled nervously at him, her sequined gown catching the light. He continued, "My family stands with me tonight, a symbol of strength, unity, and success." His eyes swept the room and then lingered on me, cold and mocking. I raised my chin slightly, meeting his gaze, refusing to flinch. He thought this was his coronation. He did not know it was his execution. Rick launched into a speech about opportunity, about the new ventures he planned once his family estate came under his management. He bragged about expanding his auto business, about investments he would make, about being a steward of wealth for the community. I felt bile rise in my throat as he spoke of generosity, using money he never earned, money that did not belong to him. When the applause faded, Evans stepped quietly onto the edge of the stage. Rick blinked in surprise, his grin faltering. "Evans, what are you doing?" he asked, the microphone amplifying his unease. Evans adjusted his tie, his voice steady. "With respect, Rick, I have business to address tonight, business that concerns this family directly." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I moved closer, my heart beat thunder in my ears. This was it. Evans opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I am the attorney representing the late Clara Carter. Tonight, in accordance with her wishes, it is time to reveal the true heir to her estate." A hush fell over the room. Rick's smile froze his face, draining of color. My mother clutched her necklace eyes, darting nervously. Evans cleared his throat and read aloud. "I, Clara Carter, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, valued at approximately $5 million, including all real property investments and assets, to my granddaughter, Emily Carter, effective upon her 20th birthday." Gasps erupted. My chest surged with a wave of electricity. The room tilted as every eye turned toward me. Rick's jaw dropped, his hand tightening on the microphone. "That is not true," he shouted, his voice cracking. She left it to Susan. Evans raised the signed document for all to see. "Witnessed, notarized, and filed with the court," he said. "This is her binding will." The crowd buzzed, whispers growing into a low roar. Cameras flashed as reporters surged forward. My knees trembled, but I forced myself onto the stage, standing tall beside Evans. I took the microphone, my voice steadier than I expected. My grandmother trusted me because she saw through the lies I said. She knew who deserved her legacy. She knew who would honor it. Rick's face flushed, crimson sweat beating at his temples. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You manipulated her," he hissed. She was old, confused. Evans cut him off. "The document is valid, Rick. Every attempt to claim otherwise will fail in court. Tonight, the truth is clear. The estate belongs to Emily." The ballroom erupted, half in applause, half in shocked chatter. I stood in the center of it all, the daughter he mocked, the girl he dismissed, no longer silent, no longer powerless. And Rick Morton, the man who believed he had crushed me, stood exposed, humiliated, undone in front of the city he tried to impress. For a moment, the ballroom seemed frozen in place. 100 faces turned toward Rick Morton as his composure cracked. He slammed the microphone back onto the stand, his voice rising into a shout that rang harsh against the marble walls. "This is a scam. She is lying. Evans is lying. None of this is real." His words bounced through the room, but instead of gaining strength, they withered. Guests shifted uncomfortably, their expressions skeptical. A councilman whispered to a reporter, his pen scribbling furiously. A banker in the front row leaned back, arms crossed, clearly done with Rick's performance. My mother Susan stood near the stage, her hands trembling, her face pale as if she wanted to disappear. Rick's eyes bulged with rage. He turned on me, jabbing a finger. "You," he spat. "You think you can take everything from me? You are nothing without me." I stepped forward, my heart hammering but my voice calm. "No, Rick. I was nothing because of you. My grandmother gave me back my worth. She gave me back my future." Gasps and nods rippled across the audience. Someone in the back actually clapped, a sharp sound that broke the tension. Rick spun toward them, red-faced, but the trickle of applause grew into a wave. People who had smiled at him earlier now clapped for me, the girl he had ridiculed for years. The sound fueled me. I turned back to the microphone, my hands steady. "For years he called me worthless," I said. "He told me I would die broke, that I would crawl for scraps. But tonight, you all see the truth. My grandmother saw me. She trusted me. She left everything to me." Rick lunged forward as if to grab the papers from Evans's hands, but 2 hotel security guards intercepted him, stepping between us. Murmurs of disapproval spread like wildfire. The man who wanted respect had shown his true face, and the crowd would not forgive it. A reporter raised her phone, recording every second. Rick shouted again, but his voice cracked hoarse, desperate. "This is not over. I will fight this." I leaned closer to the microphone, my eyes locked on his. "Go ahead, Rick. Fight all you want. Every word, every threat, every bruise, every forged document is recorded. I have everything. Evans has everything. And now so does this city." The crowd erupted again, cameras flashing, people whispering Rick's downfall into headlines before he could even stumble off the stage. He looked around, wild-eyed, searching for allies, but found only a sea of turned backs and shaking heads. My mother tried to reach for him, but even she seemed to realize the tide had shifted. Her hand hovered, then fell to her side. Rick's shoulders sagged, his tuxedo damp with sweat. The guards guided him toward the exit as his voice dwindled into mutters no one cared to hear. I stayed on the stage, the weight of the microphone in my hand, the heat of the lights on my face, but inside me, a cold, steady calm had replaced the fear. For years, he controlled the narrative. Tonight, I had taken it back. I looked out over the room and spoke not just to the guests, but to myself, to the girl I had been. Silence is not weakness. Endurance is not surrender. Tonight you saw the truth. I am not broken. I am the heir of Clara Carter, and I will honor her name." Applause thundered, echoing off the chandeliers, rolling over me like a tide. For the first time in years, I stood tall, no longer the caged girl at his table, but the woman who had survived and claimed her place. Rick Morton left the ballroom that night, humiliated, his reputation shattered, his lies scattered like glass. And I knew as the applause surrounded me that nothing would ever be the same again. June 2024 arrived with heavy summer storms in Kentucky, thunder rolling across the Ohio River, lightning splitting the sky like an omen. Inside me, though, the storm had already broken. The night of the gala replayed across television screens and newspaper pages for weeks. Louisville Courier-Journal ran a headline on June 2nd, "Stepdad exposed at Gala Carter. Granddaughter inherits $5 million estate." Lexington Herald Leader published a feature calling it "The Fall of Rick Morton," complete with quotes from guests describing his shouting, his sweat, his humiliation in front of 200 witnesses. Reporters called the house nonstop, but I refused to answer. Evans handled the inquiries with precision, confirming only what the will stated, refusing to be baited into drama. Yet the drama unfolded without us. Every news anchor seemed eager to replay the footage of Rick being escorted out of the Marriott ballroom. His tuxedo rumpled, his face red, his voice cracking as he shouted that it was not over. The image became a symbol of hypocrisy, a man who claimed strength but collapsed under truth. Neighbors in Louisville who once waved politely at Rick now avoided eye contact. The auto shop he had boasted about lost clients daily. By June 10, local TV reported that tax authorities had opened an investigation into his business practices. Former employees came forward with complaints about unpaid wages. His empire of intimidation was dissolving piece by piece, not by my hand directly, but by the weight of his own corruption exposed to daylight. Susan walked through it all like a ghost. At first, she clung to him, insisting to distant relatives that it was all a misunderstanding. But the more the headlines multiplied, the more her phone calls went unanswered, the more invitations dried up, the more she stood isolated. I watched her at the grocery store one afternoon, clutching a basket of bread and milk as two women from church turned away without speaking. She saw it too. Her cheeks flushed, and she hurried out, leaving the items behind. She wanted to blame me. I could see it in her eyes at home. But the truth was, she had tied herself to Rick's downfall long before I raised my voice. Evans called me to his office on June 15th. His expression was steady, but his words carried finality. "Emily probate is nearly complete. The court has recognized your inheritance. The accounts are being transferred. The Lexington property is now yours." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were papers with my name on them, not his, not Susan's. Emily Carter, sole heir. My fingers shook as I traced the letters. For so long I had lived under Rick's roof, under his rules, under his shadow. Now the shadow was lifting, yet the weight of freedom was heavier than I expected. Walking home that day, I felt both light and burdened. The money was never the point. The point was survival dignity, the restoration of my grandmother's voice. Still, the reality pressed in. $5 million meant responsibility. It meant decisions that mattered. That night, I sat in my room, the paper spread on the bed, and whispered into the silence, "Grandma, I hope I do this right." Outside, the world shifted quickly. Reporters still camped at the end of the street cameras, ready to catch any glimpse of Rick, but he had gone to ground. Rumors swirled that he was staying with a cousin outside Jefferson County. Others said he was hiding in Tennessee. Wherever he was shrinking. The man who once roared at me daily was now reduced to whispers in the news. Susan moved around the house, aimlessly silent, distant, unable to decide if she was still his ally or finally his victim. I watched her and felt nothing. No anger, no pity. Just distance, like watching a stranger drift further out to sea. By the end of June, I understood that the gala had not just exposed Rick. It had ended the life I once knew. The girl he had called worthless no longer existed. In her place stood someone who owned property accounts and, more importantly, the truth. July 2024 dawned hot and relentless, the kind of Kentucky summer where the air feels like it is pressing down on your chest. For Rick Morton, the heat came not from the sun, but from investigators. By the first week of July, the Courier-Journal reported that his auto shop was under full audit. Former employees filed statements about unpaid overtime, customers complained about fraud, and whispers of tax evasion grew louder. Each day brought a new headline. Stepdad accused of wage theft. Morton business tied to suspicious loans. The man who once sneered at me for being powerless now had his name dragged through mud he could not wash off. Reporters tried to reach him, but he had vanished from Louisville, his phone disconnected, his shop shuttered. The community treated him like a ghost, but not the kind that inspires sympathy. He was the ghost people spit at in conversation, the cautionary tale told at coffee shops. My mother Susan bore the fallout like an anchor chained to a sinking ship. By mid-July, she had stopped attending church. Invitations to luncheons dried up. Even her sister from Lexington stopped returning calls. I heard her crying at night behind her bedroom door, muffled sobs that carried no words. She did not apologize not once, but the way she avoided my eyes said enough. She was alone, and she knew it. Part of me wanted to feel pity, but another part remembered every time she turned her face away while Rick shouted at me. Silence has consequences. Now, she was living them. On July 12th, I met Evans again in his Lexington office. He placed another folder in front of me, his tone calm but firm. Emily, everything is finalized. The Lexington property is legally yours. The accounts, the investments all transferred. The total assets stand at just over $5 million. I opened the folder, slowly staring at the bank documents, the deed with my name, the official court stamp. For years, I had been told I was worthless. Now the state of Kentucky itself recognized me as rightful heir. My chest tightened and I whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." Evans smiled faintly. "She trusted you for a reason. Use it well." That night, I drove to Lexington alone for the first time, the car humming beneath me like freedom. I parked in front of Clara's brick home, the windows shuttered, but the garden still blooming with hydrangeas. I unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender, just as it had when she was alive. I wandered through the rooms, touching the furniture, the photos, the books she had loved. This was not just property. It was memory. It was sanctuary. It was proof that Rick had failed to erase me. In that quiet house, I decided what to do. I would not waste this gift on revenge or greed. I would restore it, preserve it, and use the resources to build something that honored her name. Over the next weeks, I met with financial advisors Evans recommended. I opened accounts in my name. I began drafting plans for a foundation to support young women in Kentucky who faced abuse in silence like I had. Each decision steadied me, each paper signed made me feel taller, freer, more alive. Meanwhile, Rick's name sank deeper into disgrace. By the end of July, federal investigators had joined the probe into his finances. His cousin kicked him out, his so-called friends cut ties, and every whisper I heard in town ended with the same verdict: he got what he deserved. Susan lingered in the Louisville house, lost in shame, while I spent more time in Lexington, reshaping my grandmother's home into a place of strength. One evening, I stood on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees, the cicadas humming, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Peace. The battle was not only won, it was finished. By the fall of 2024, the air in Kentucky cooled the leaves along the streets of Lexington, turning shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time in years, I breathed without the weight of fear pressing down on my chest. The inheritance had been secured, the investigations into Rick had deepened until his name became synonymous with disgrace, and the Lexington home had transformed from a relic of grief into a place of purpose. On October 5th, I stood in the parlor of that home, now refurbished into an office space as the Clara Foundation was officially launched. Reporters gathered on the lawn, community leaders filled the living room, and women of all ages who had endured abuse stood in quiet rows, their eyes glimmering with hope. I wore a simple navy suit, the same color as the dress I had worn at the gala, a subtle reminder that silence no longer defined me. When I stepped to the podium, I thought of Clara's whisper one day, "Emily, you will have the power," and I felt her spirit steadying me. I spoke about survival, about resilience, about how silence had been my shield, but truth had been my sword. I promised scholarships for young women who wanted to escape cycles of violence, safe housing initiatives, and legal resources for those too afraid to speak. The applause that followed was not the chaotic roar of the gala, but a warm, rising sound, a wave of affirmation. For the first time, I was not defined by what I had endured, but by what I was building. 2 weeks later, the Lexington Herald Leader ran a feature with the headline, "From Victim to Visionary, Emily Carter's Fight for Kentucky Women." The article included photos of me standing on the porch of Clara's home, surrounded by women who now called it a safe place. That recognition mattered, but not as much as the letters I began receiving daily. Young women wrote of their bruises, of their fear, of their longing for a voice. Older women wrote of marriages survived of silence carried for decades. Each letter became a reminder that my story was not an ending, but a beginning. Yet even as the foundation grew, the past tried to push its way back. One late evening in November, I heard a knock on the Lexington door. I opened it to find my mother Susan standing on the porch. Her shoulders hunched, her eyes rimmed with red. She clutched her purse as if it were a lifeline. "Emily," she whispered, "I need to talk to you." My chest tightened. For months, she had been absent, lost in the wreckage of Rick's downfall. Now she stood before me, fragile, trembling, and I knew the moment had come when the wounds of silence would finally be confronted. Susan stood on the porch, shivering, despite the mild November night, her eyes darting as if she expected Rick to appear from the shadows, even though everyone knew by then he was gone. I stepped aside slowly, letting her enter the house that once belonged to her mother, the house that now was mine. She hesitated at the threshold, her fingers grazing the doorframe as though she was trespassing. Inside, the parlor glowed warmly with lamps and the scent of lavender candles. She looked around at the photographs I had hung of Clara, of me as a child, of the women we were now helping through the foundation. Tears filled her eyes. "I never thought I would see this place again," she whispered. I crossed my arms, not cold, but bracing myself. "You are here now. Why?" She turned toward me, her face lined with exhaustion, her voice trembling. "Emily." "I am sorry." The words came halting, as if her tongue had to force them past years of silence. "I should have protected you. I should have stopped him. Every night I hear your voice. I see your face when he yelled, when he hit, when I looked away. I thought staying silent would keep the peace, but it only broke us both." She pressed her hands together tightly. "Please, Emily, forgive me." My throat tightened, not with pity, but with the weight of everything unsaid. I remembered every bruise, every insult, every moment she had turned away when I needed her most. For years I had longed to hear those words, but now that they were spoken, they did not heal. They opened wounds that would never truly close. "Forgiveness," I said slowly, "is not forgetting. Forgiveness does not erase what you allowed. You chose him over me every time." She flinched as though struck, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was weak," she whispered. "I thought I needed him. I thought without him I would be nothing. I let fear decide everything." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling, though my voice stayed firm. "I do forgive you, Mom, but forgiveness does not mean return. It does not mean I let you back into my life as if nothing happened. This house, this foundation, this life I am building, it is safe because he is gone and because you no longer have power over me." Her shoulders sagged, the sob escaping her chest like something torn loose. "I forgive you," I repeated softly, "but you cannot come back into my life. You cannot undo what you stood by and allowed." She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. For a moment, I almost reached for her, the old instinct of a daughter longing for comfort rising, but I held myself still. Some embraces do not heal. Some distance is the only protection left. She stayed a few minutes longer, speaking in broken fragments about her loneliness, her shame, her fear of growing old with no one. I listened, my heart aching, but my resolve steady. When she finally rose to leave, I walked her to the door. As she stepped onto the porch, she turned back, her eyes searching mine. "Maybe someday you will let me back in?" "Maybe," I said, "but not today." She nodded as if she had expected nothing more and walked into the night. I closed the door, leaning against it, tears sliding down my cheeks, not from weakness but from release. The chains of her silence had bound me for years. Now I was free. In the weeks that followed, the foundation grew rapidly. Donations flowed in after the Herald Leader and Courier-Journal published stories about our mission. Women came to us not only from Louisville and Lexington, but from small towns across Kentucky. Each face carried its own story of silence and survival, and each reminded me why Clara had chosen me. The money she left was not meant to make me comfortable. It was meant to give me power to change lives. By December, the Clara Foundation had opened its first safe house in Lexington, a modest brick building with beds, counseling rooms, and a kitchen where women could gather. On opening day, I walked through the halls listening to the quiet hum of new beginnings and felt Clara's presence in every corner. At night, I often stood on the porch of her old home, now our headquarters, staring up at the stars. I thought of her whisper one day, "Emily, you will have the power." She had been right, but the power was not the money. It was the courage to stand, to speak, to survive. Rick Morton's name faded from headlines by Christmas. The last article I read reported he had fled Kentucky under the weight of legal charges, a broken man hiding from debts and disgrace. Susan remained in Louisville, living quietly in the house Rick once controlled, isolated and forgotten. Our paths no longer crossed. My story was no longer about them. It was about me. It was about every young woman who thought silence was her only option. In late December, as the year turned, I sat at my desk, writing the first annual report for the foundation. I ended it with the words I had spoken at the gala, words that still echoed in my heart. Silence is not weakness. Endurance is not surrender. Speaking truth may break families, may break illusions, but it also builds futures. When I finally closed the report, I turned to the camera, recording my final message for the year, knowing it would reach not just donors, but women across the country. If you are watching this and you feel powerless, if you think you are invisible, I promise you, you are not. The people who break you are not your family. The ones who help you rise again are. Clara gave me more than money. She gave me a voice. And now, I am passing that gift to you. I looked into the camera and let the silence stretch, the same silence that once trapped me, now transformed into strength. Then I asked my final call to the ones who had walked this journey with me. Do you believe Emily should have let her mother back into her life? Tell me in the comments. Tell me your story. I want to hear it. The light on the camera blinked red. The year ended not with fear, not with silence, but with truth spoken into the world, and that truth was mine.